Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we gather not merely to tell a story, but to undertake an expedition. We are traveling back in time, not as tourists, but as coroners, tasked with performing an autopsy on a dead world. The case file is one of the oldest and coldest in human history, a mystery that has perplexed and fascinated scholars for generations. The scene of the crime is not a single darkened room, but the sun-drenched shores of the entire eastern Mediterranean. The victims were not individuals, but a glittering constellation of Bronze Age empires. And the alleged perpetrators, they are a legion of ghosts, a phantom federation of warriors known to us only by the name their terrified victims gave them: the Sea Peoples. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries, past the Romans, past the Greeks, past even the earliest prophets of the Old Testament. We are going to the year 1250 BCE, the 13th century before Christ. This is the Late Bronze Age, and it is a world basking in the luminous glow of a long and prosperous summer. Do not mistake this for a primitive age of scattered, grunting tribes. This was a world of breathtaking sophistication, an era of titans. In the lands we now call Turkey, the mighty Hittite Empire, a superpower forged in the Anatolian highlands, governed a vast and diverse territory from its Cyclopean capital, Hattusa. Its kings were warrior scholars, its armies were feared, and its diplomats were masters of a complex international game. To the south, in the timeless valley of the Nile, the new kingdom of Egypt stood as a monument to permanence itself. This was the Egypt of the great Ramesside pharaohs, heirs to a legacy that included the boy king Tutankhamun and the conqueror Thutmose III. Its temples at Karnak and Luxor were forests of stone. Its wealth seemed limitless, and its pharaoh was considered a living god on earth. Across the wine-dark Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks, the people who would one day become the mythic heroes of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, held sway. From their formidable palace fortresses at Mycenae, with its iconic Lion Gate, and Pylos and Tiryns, their fleets of oared galleys dominated the sea lanes, their merchants growing rich on trade, their warrior kings clad in boar's tusk helmets and terrifying bronze armor. And linking them all, a vibrant tapestry of lesser kingdoms and city-states. The trading hub of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, the copper-rich island of Cyprus, known as Al-Ashia, and the Canaanite ports of the Levant. This was, in many ways, the first truly globalized world. An intricate web of diplomacy and trade bound these powers together. Great kings from the Nile to the Euphrates addressed each other as brother in their formal correspondence, painstakingly inscribed by skilled scribes onto clay tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, the universal language of diplomacy. They exchanged ambassadors and intelligence. They negotiated treaties like the famous Treaty of Kadesh between the Egyptians and Hittites, the world's first known international peace agreement. They arranged strategic royal marriages, sending princesses laden with dowries across the sea to foreign courts. And they traded. Oh, how they traded! Ships laden with copper ingots from Cyprus, shaped like ox hides for easy carrying, plied the same waters as vessels carrying tin from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, gold from the mines of Nubia, fragrant olive oil and wine from the Aegean, intricate ivory carvings from the Levant, and brilliant blue glass from Egypt. The wreck of one such ship, discovered off the coast of Uluburun in Turkey, is a time capsule of this lost world, a single vessel carrying goods from no fewer than 9 different cultures. To a person living in 1250 BCE, this world, this interconnected, wealthy and powerful system must have seemed eternal, as solid and enduring as the Great Pyramids of Giza, which were already ancient even then. It had its conflicts, yes, its rivalries and its skirmishes, but the fundamental structure of civilization felt secure. And then, in the space of less than 50 years, in the lifetime of a single person, it all burned. From the shores of Greece to the plains of Anatolia, from the island of Cyprus to the coast of Syria, a wave of unprecedented, catastrophic destruction swept across this brilliant world. It was an apocalypse, A systemic failure so swift and so complete that it remains almost unparalleled in the annals of human history. Great cities, urban centers that had been continuously inhabited for centuries, were violently overthrown, their palaces and temples consumed by infernos so hot they vitrified stone and baked clay tablets into ceramic permanence. Hattusa, the magnificent capital of the Hittites, was sacked, burned, and abandoned forever. Its great gates toppled, its archives scattered. Ugarit, the pearl of the Syrian coast, was so utterly annihilated that its final panicked communications were found still in the kiln where they were being fired when the attackers came. In Greece, the great Mycenaean palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns were all reduced to blackened rubble. And with them, an entire civilization's institutional memory was erased. The knowledge of writing, the elegant script we call Linear B, was lost to the Greek world for over 400 years. Trade routes that had been the arteries of this world were severed. Diplomatic connections vanished. Entire populations seemed to have disappeared from the archaeological record. It was a civilization reset button, a plunge into a centuries-long dark age. This event, this sudden and violent end to an entire epoch, is what we now call the Bronze Age collapse. For over a century, scholars have debated the cause. They have pointed to powerful earthquakes, to prolonged and devastating drought, to internal rebellions, to disruptions in the metals trade. And without a doubt, all of these factors played a role. They were the pre-existing conditions, the dry tinder waiting for a spark. But the ancient records that survived this cataclysm, the eyewitness accounts carved in stone and pressed into clay, all point to a single terrifying catalyst. They speak of a new and unidentified enemy, a shadowy coalition of peoples who came from the sea. They were a human tidal wave, a mysterious confederation of warriors, pirates, and migrants who crashed upon the shores of the Old World, leaving only fire and ruin in their wake. They were the principal agents of this destruction, the spark that ignited the dry tinder and burned a golden age to the ground. They were the Sea Peoples. Tonight, we will embark on our investigation into one of the greatest historical mysteries of all time. We are going to become cold case detectives. We will examine the evidence left behind on the monumental walls of Egyptian temples and on the scorched clay tablets of a fallen city. We will sift through the archaeological ashes of forgotten empires and listen for the whispers of their ghosts. We will try to piece together the identity of this enigmatic foe, to unmask the legion that brought about the end of the world. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? What drove their campaign of terror? And how did they succeed in toppling civilizations that had stood for centuries? So find a comfortable position. Let the distractions of the modern world recede. Let the gentle darkness settle around you. Our journey begins now, on the shores of a world on the brink of annihilation, as we go in search of the phantoms who ended an age. Part 1. The world that was a portrait of the late Bronze Age. Before we can comprehend the scale of the destruction, we must first appreciate the grandeur of what was lost. We cannot understand the shock of the Bronze Age collapse without first walking the streets of the world that collapsed. So let us begin our investigation not with the crime, but with the victims, by painting a more detailed portrait of this interconnected world in its final glorious days. Our first stop is the beating heart of the southern world, the Kingdom of Egypt. In the 13th century BCE, Egypt was an ancient land, already possessed of a history stretching back nearly 2 millennia. The New Kingdom, the period we are in, was the era of Egypt's imperial zenith. The pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties were not just passive rulers. They were conquerors and builders on a scale that beggars belief. They had projected their power north into the Levant, controlling a string of vassal states in Canaan and Syria, and south into Nubia, securing access to the vast gold mines that fueled their economy. Imagine the city of Thebes, the religious capital. Its temples of Karnak and Luxor were not single buildings but sprawling complexes, cities of the gods that grew with each successive pharaoh. Karnak's great hypostyle hall was a forest of 134 massive sandstone columns, so vast that the cathedrals of Notre Dame and St. Peter's could fit comfortably inside it. These were not just places of worship. They were the centers of the Egyptian economy. The Temple of Amoni-Asare at Karnak was the single largest landowner in Egypt, possessing vast tracts of agricultural land, herds of cattle, fleets of ships, and its own workshops and administration. The power of the priesthood was immense, a state within the state. Egyptian society was a pyramid, with the divine pharaoh at its apex. Below him was a sophisticated and highly literate bureaucracy of scribes, priests, and officials who managed the intricate machinery of the state. They recorded everything: the grain harvest, the tax revenue, the distribution of rations to workers, the deployment of troops. It was a world of order, of cosmic balance, known as Ma'at. This concept of divine order, harmony, and justice was central to the Egyptian worldview. The pharaoh's primary duty was to uphold Ma'at and defeat its opposite, Isfet, or chaos. And for centuries they had succeeded. The pharaoh whose reign immediately precedes the main chaos was Ramesses II, known to history as Ramesses the Great. He was a master of propaganda and a builder of monuments on a truly megalomaniacal scale. He ruled for an astonishing 66 years, and his legacy was everywhere. From the colossal statues of himself at Abu Simbel, carved into a mountainside in far-off Nubia, to his sprawling mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, he ensured his name would never be forgotten. His greatest military achievement was the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire around 1274 BCE. Though the battle was more of a bloody stalemate, Ramesses depicted it on temple walls across Egypt as a stunning personal victory, where he single-handedly turned the tide against the Hittite hordes. This battle is significant because it led, years later, to the Treaty of Kadesh. A copy of this treaty, inscribed on a silver tablet, was sent to Egypt, and its text survives. It is a document of stunning modernity. It establishes a non-aggression pact, a mutual defense alliance, and provisions for the extradition of political refugees. It speaks of brotherhood and eternal peace between the two great superpowers. This was the world Ramesses the Great bequeathed to his successors: a stable, powerful, wealthy Egypt, at peace with its only true rival, seemingly at the apex of its glory. He was succeeded by his 13th son, Merneptah, and it would be on Merneptah's watch that the first dark clouds of our story would begin to gather. Now let us travel north, to the land of Egypt's great rival and eventual partner, the Hittite Empire. If Egypt was the ancient, elegant monolith, the Hittites were the rugged, pragmatic newcomers. From their base in the rocky highlands of central Anatolia, they had forged an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the banks of the Euphrates. Their capital was the city of Hattusa, one of the most remarkable cities of the ancient world. Perched on a rocky gorge, protected by ravines and a massive double wall of stone that snaked for miles across the landscape, Hattusa was a fortress capital. Its gates were monumental works of art and intimidation, flanked by huge, carved stone lions or sphinxes. Inside its walls was a sprawling complex of temples, palaces, and administrative buildings. The largest temple was dedicated to the storm god of Hutti and the sun goddess of Arena, the chief deities of the Hittite state. Unlike the Egyptian pantheon, the Hittite divine world was a chaotic mix, a land of 1,000 gods, incorporating the deities of the many peoples they had conquered. Hittite society was feudal and militaristic, dominated by a warrior aristocracy whose lives revolved around the chariot. The Hittites were pioneers in chariot warfare, and their three-man heavy chariots had been the terror of the Bronze Age battlefield. But their greatest strength was perhaps their political acumen. The Hittites governed their empire through a complex system of vassal treaties. They would conquer a smaller kingdom, then bind its ruler to them with a sworn oath of loyalty. The vassal king was allowed to rule his own land, but he had to pay tribute, provide troops for Hittite campaigns, and follow Hittite foreign policy. You shall be my friend, and I shall be your friend, the treaties read. But you shall be my enemy's enemy. This system allowed them to control a vast and ethnically diverse territory, with a relatively small core population. The Hittite archives discovered in the ruins of Hattusa contain thousands of clay tablets detailing every aspect of their civilization. Laws, treaties, diplomatic letters, religious rituals, myths, and historical annals. The Hittite law code is particularly revealing. While still harsh by modern standards, it was remarkably progressive for its time, often preferring restitution and fines over the brutal physical punishments of the eye for an eye variety found elsewhere in the Near East. In the mid-13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire was at its peak. Having fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, they now coexisted in a tense but stable balance of power. They controlled the vital trade routes for metals coming from the east and north. They were a sophisticated, powerful, and seemingly resilient empire. But they had a hidden vulnerability. Unlike Egypt, which was nourished by the predictable annual flood of the Nile, the Anatolian heartland was entirely dependent on rainfall for its agriculture. In a world of changing climates, this would prove to be a fatal weakness. Finally, we sail west across the Aegean, to the world of the Mycenaeans. This is the Greece of legend, the world that gave us the stories of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus. The Mycenaeans were not a single, unified empire like the Hittites or Egyptians. Their world was a patchwork of small but wealthy kingdoms, each centered on a heavily fortified palace. These palaces at places like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes were the nerve centers of their civilization. They were built with what the later Greeks called Cyclopean masonry, massive, irregular blocks of stone fitted together without mortar, so huge that it was believed only the mythical one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, could have built them. Inside these formidable walls, a king, known as the Wanax, presided over a highly centralized and bureaucratic state. We know this because the Mycenaeans, unlike the later Greeks of the Dark Ages, were literate. They used a script called Linear B, an early form of Greek written on clay tablets. And like their counterparts in Egypt and Hutti, their scribes recorded everything. The thousands of Linear B tablets found at Pylos and other sites are not epic poems or histories, but administrative ledgers. They list quotas of flax, allocations of perfumed oil, inventories of chariot wheels, and the names of bronzesmiths and their required metal contributions. They paint a picture of a command economy, where every aspect of production, from sheep shearing to bronze forging, was controlled and recorded by the central palace. This system generated considerable wealth. The famous shaft graves at Mycenae, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, yielded a treasure trove of gold, including the stunning funerary mask he mistakenly identified as that of Agamemnon. The Mycenaeans were accomplished sailors and traders. Their distinctive pottery is found all over the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Syria. They were also formidable warriors. Their art is filled with images of combat: boar tusk helmets, figure-eight shields, long spears, and warriors fighting from chariots. The later Greek legends of the Trojan War likely contain a kernel of truth about this era, time of great overseas expeditions, of sieges and battles fought by warrior kings for wealth and glory. So this was the world on the eve of the collapse. Three great, distinct civilizations, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, bound together by a complex network of diplomacy and trade. They were the three pillars holding up the roof of the Bronze Age world. And between them, in the spaces they created, thrived the other key players: the great merchant city of Ugarit, a cosmopolitan port where merchants from across the known world mingled; the island of Cyprus, the Copper Island, whose mines were essential for the bronze that gave the age its name; and the scattered but wealthy Canaanite city-states along the Levantine coast. For a moment in time the system worked. It was stable. It was prosperous. It was brilliant. And it was all about to end. Part 2. The Gathering Storm, Omens and First Tremors. No great storm materializes from a clear blue sky. There are always warning signs. A change in the wind, a darkening of the horizon, the distant rumble of thunder. The Bronze Age collapse was no different. The great empires of the 13th century BCE may have appeared robust, but they were suffering from a series of underlying conditions that made them exquisitely vulnerable to a sudden shock. In this part of our investigation, we will examine the gathering storm, the confluence of factors that weakened the ancient world and set the stage for the arrival of the Sea Peoples. The first and perhaps most fundamental factor was climate change. This is not modern speculation. It is a conclusion drawn from hard scientific evidence. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study past climates, have analyzed a range of natural archives from the eastern Mediterranean. By drilling deep cores into the beds of lakes and seas, they can analyze the layers of ancient sediment. The types of pollen trapped in these layers reveal what kinds of plants were growing, indicating whether the climate was wet or dry. The chemical composition of microscopic shells from foraminifera, tiny sea creatures, can reveal the temperature and salinity of the water they lived in. Tree rings from ancient timbers, a science known as dendrochronology, show patterns of growth that correspond directly to annual rainfall. Across the board, these proxies tell the same story. Beginning around 1250 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of prolonged and severe drought. This wasn't a single bad year. It may have been decades of significantly reduced rainfall. Some studies suggest it was a 300-year drought event, one of the most severe climatic downturns of the last 5,000 years. The impact of such a drought would have been catastrophic, but it would not have been felt equally. Egypt, the gift of the Nile, was largely insulated. Its agriculture depended on the annual summer flood, which was fed by monsoonal rains far to the south in Ethiopia, outside the drought-affected zone. The Nile might have been lower some years, but it never failed completely. But for the Hittites in Anatolia and the Mycenaeans in Greece, it was a death sentence. Their civilizations were built on rain-fed agriculture. As the rains failed, year after year, the harvests would have shriveled in the fields. Grain shortages would have become chronic, leading to widespread famine. A starving population is a desperate population. A government that cannot feed its people loses its legitimacy. The complex, top-down palace economies of the Hittites and Mycenaeans were incredibly efficient in times of surplus, but they were brittle. They had no resilience in the face of systemic agricultural failure. We can hear the echoes of this crisis in the surviving texts. A letter from the Hittite queen Pujahipa to the pharaoh Ramesses II pleads for a shipment of grain to keep my land of Hutti alive. This was not a standard trade request. It was a desperate plea from one superpower to another. Later Hittite records from the final years speak of shipping grain from the Syrian vassal states northward to the starving Anatolian heartland. The empire was beginning to eat itself to survive. Famine breeds instability. It would have led to social unrest, peasant uprisings against the palace elites who controlled the granaries. It would have driven vast numbers of people from their now barren farmlands, creating a massive internal refugee crisis. Entire villages would have been abandoned as people took to the roads in search of food. This internal chaos would have crippled the empires from within, long before any external enemy appeared on the horizon. The second factor was the inherent fragility of the globalized Bronze Age economy. Its lifeblood was bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively plentiful, with major sources in Cyprus and Anatolia. But tin was incredibly rare. The major sources of tin for the Bronze Age world were located far away, in what is now Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall in Britain. The tin trade was a long-distance, high-stakes enterprise, dependent on stable political conditions and secure sea lanes. As the drought and famine created political instability, these delicate trade routes began to break down. With the supply of tin disrupted, the production of bronze would have ground to a halt. This was not just a matter of losing access to a luxury good. Bronze was the essential material of the age. It was used for tools, for plows, and most critically for weapons and armor. An army without bronze was no army at all. The palace economies, which had controlled the bronze industry, would have been unable to equip their soldiers. Their military power, the very basis of their authority, would have evaporated. This resource curse meant that the very thing that made them powerful also made them incredibly vulnerable. Third, the political landscape itself was becoming more volatile. The long, peaceful reign of Ramesses the Great in Egypt may have created a veneer of stability, but it also masked underlying tensions. In the lands of the Mycenaeans, there is growing archaeological evidence of increased fortification and internal conflict in the decades leading up to the final collapse. Some palaces were destroyed and rebuilt, walls were strengthened, and secret underground water cisterns were constructed, all signs of a society preparing for siege warfare. The Trojan War, if it reflects a historical reality, may be a memory of this period of escalating conflict, a time when raiding and piracy became endemic as kingdoms preyed on each other to make up for their own shortfalls. It is into this world of drought, famine, economic breakdown, and rising conflict that we see the first concrete appearance of our mysterious antagonists. The first tremor of the coming earthquake was recorded in Egypt during the 5th year of the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, around 1208 BCE. As we noted, Merneptah recorded his triumph on a massive granite slab, the Merneptah stele, also known as the Israel stele for its first ever mention of Israel as a people in Canaan. But the main focus of the stele is a crisis on Egypt's western frontier. Merneptah faced a major invasion from the Lebu and Meshwesh tribes of Libya. Crucially, the Libyan chief Mary was not alone. The stele tells us he had forged a grand coalition with a new and terrifying type of ally: foreigners of the sea. The inscription lists them by name: the Aquesh, the Teresh, the Lukka, the Shurden, and the Shikalesh. Merneptah's account of the battle is triumphant. He describes a 6-hour clash in which the Egyptian army routed the invaders, slaughtering thousands and taking many more captive. The wretched, fallen chief of Libya fled under the cover of night alone, with no plume on his head, his feet bare. His wives were seized before his very eyes, the stele boasts. But reading between the lines of the propaganda, we can see how serious the threat was. These were not simply raiding parties. The inscription makes a point of mentioning that the Libyans and their sea allies brought their wives and their children, and their cattle with them. They were not coming to plunder and leave. They were a migratory host, driven from their own lands, seeking to conquer and settle in the fertile Nile Delta. They were desperate. The inscription also gives us some tantalizing, if grisly, clues about their identity. Of the defeated Aquesh, the text notes that they were of the countries of the sea, and they had no foreskins. The fact that their uncircumcised status was worthy of mention suggests they came from a culture where this was the norm, unlike the Egyptians and their Semitic neighbors. This has long been seen as a strong hint pointing towards the Aegean world, where circumcision was not practiced. Merneptah had won a great victory. He had repelled the first wave. He had secured Egypt's borders and upheld Maat. But his victory proclamation was not an epitaph for his enemies. It was a prologue. He had seen the face of the coming storm, a coalition of land-based migrants and seafaring warriors, a new and dangerous hybrid threat. For the next 30 years, an uneasy quiet settled over the region. But it was the quiet of a world holding its breath. The system was broken. The dominoes had begun to fall. And the main invasion, the great tsunami of which Merneptah's battle was but the first tremor, was about to make landfall. Part 3. The Crime: A World in Flames. The 30 years following Merneptah's victory were a period of deceptive calm, the eerie silence between a flash of lightning and the deafening clap of thunder. In Egypt, a series of short-lived pharaohs struggled with internal political strife. In the Hittite Empire, the famine worsened, and the kingdom began to fray at the edges. And then around the year 1180 BCE, the storm broke in all its unimaginable fury. This was the main event, the great wave of destruction that would sweep away the Bronze Age world forever. Our investigation now moves to the crime scenes themselves, sifting through the rubble of fallen cities to understand the nature of this ancient apocalypse. Our first and most eloquent witness is the city of Ugarit. As we've discussed, Ugarit was not a great power, but a vibrant cosmopolitan port city on the coast of modern-day Syria. It was a vassal of the Hittite Empire, a crucial node in the international trade network. Its location made it wealthy, but it also made it fatally exposed. It would be one of the first major dominoes to fall. In the ruins of Ugarit, in a small kiln in the house of a high-ranking official named Rapanu, archaeologists found a trove of clay tablets that comprise one of the most dramatic archives in all of history. They were letters, the city's final diplomatic correspondence, being fired for preservation when the city was destroyed. The fire that consumed Ugarit baked these tablets into ceramic immortality, preserving for us a real-time, blow-by-blow account of a city in its death throes. It is like discovering the black box recorder from a downed airliner. Let us examine these letters more closely. One is a desperate plea from Ugarit's last king, a man named Amurapi, to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, who was his nominal father or superior in the regional hierarchy. The king of Cyprus had apparently written to Amurapi, chastising him for being unaware that enemy ships had been spotted. Amurapi's reply is a gut-wrenching mix of panic and defensiveness. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hutti, the Hittite heartland, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? They have not yet arrived back, and thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here have inflicted much damage upon us. The situation is tragically clear. Ugarit's own military forces were away, fighting for their Hittite overlords, likely against other bands of the very same enemy further north. The city was left naked and defenseless. And note the detail. He mentions just 7 enemy ships. This wasn't a massive armada. A small, swift raiding force was enough to cause chaos and burn his coastal towns. This was a new kind of ancient warfare, asymmetrical, unpredictable, and terrifyingly effective. Another tablet from the same kiln is a response from a high-ranking Hittite official to the governor of Ugarit. It is a harsh, demanding letter, ordering the governor to provide 2,000 measures of grain to be sent to Cilicia on the southern Anatolian coast, presumably to feed the starving Hittite army. It's a sign of how stretched the empire was. But the letter also contains a chilling line, almost a throwaway comment, that shows the Hittites were aware of the wider threat. As for that matter concerning the Shikaleu who live on ships, the letter mentions before moving on. The Shikaleu are almost certainly the Shikalesh from the Egyptian lists. The threat was known. It was being discussed in the highest circles. But no one seemed able to stop it. The most famous letter, however, is from the great Hittite king himself, Suppiluliuma II, addressed to Amurapi. It is a reply to a letter now lost, in which the king of Ugarit must have confessed his terror. The Hittite king's response is cold and unsympathetic. As for what you have written to me, ships of the enemy have been seen at sea. Well, you must remain firm. Indeed, for your part, how can you be afraid? Fortify your towns. Bring your infantry and your chariots into them, and wait for the enemy with great resolution. It's the voice of a distant commander, out of touch with the reality on the ground, telling a man whose house is on fire to simply be brave. The final tablet in the sequence is an internal report. It is short, frantic, and appears to be written from a lookout post. It describes a sighting of the enemy fleet. Then at the bottom a hasty, almost illegible scrawl added later. It describes fire and destruction. After that, the record of Ugarit goes silent. The city was violently sacked and burned, never to be reoccupied. Its name was lost to history for 3,000 years, until its rediscovery by a farmer plowing his field in 1928. From the ashes of Ugarit, we turn our gaze north and west, to the heartland of the great powers. The fate of the Hittite Empire is shrouded in more mystery, as their final moments were not so meticulously recorded. But the archaeological evidence is brutally eloquent. The great capital, Hattusa, which had weathered so many storms, was violently destroyed around 1180 BCE. Its massive walls were breached, its temples looted, its grand palaces and archives put to the torch. For centuries the city lay abandoned, its stone lions standing silent guard over a wasteland. Other major Hittite urban centers across Anatolia, places like Tarsus, Alaka Hoyuk, and Karoglan, show a similar layer of fiery destruction at exactly the same time. The entire infrastructure of the Hittite state appears to have been decapitated in a single coordinated wave of violence. Who was responsible? While internal rebellion and famine certainly played a part, the finger of blame again points to the sea. A letter found in the Ugaritic archive, from the king of a Hittite vassal state, reports a naval defeat at the hands of ships from Alashiya, Cyprus. This is confusing, as Cyprus was also a victim. It suggests a world of shifting allegiances and widespread chaos on the seas, a pirate-like environment that the land-based Hittite military was powerless to control. The Hittite Empire did not fade away. It was violently extinguished. Now we must cross the Aegean to Greece, to witness the fall of the Mycenaean world. Here the picture is one of total systemic collapse. The great palace fortresses, the very symbols of Mycenaean power, were all destroyed in a wave of violence between 1200 and 1150 BCE. At Mycenae, the home of the mythical Agamemnon, the citadel was attacked and burned. At Tiryns, the massive Cyclopean walls were toppled, perhaps by an earthquake, but the palace was also consumed by a fire so intense it turned clay to glass. The most poignant evidence comes from the palace of Nestor at Pylos, on the southwestern coast of Greece. Like Ugarit, Pylos yielded a magnificent archive of linear bead tablets, which were accidentally preserved when the palace was torched. These tablets, much like the Ugaritic letters, give us a snapshot of an administration in its final frantic moments. The Pylos tablets do not speak of famine, but of an imminent military threat from the sea. One series of tablets, known as the Oka tablets, details the dispatch of military units to guard the coastline. They are deployment orders for watchers on the coast. They list the names of the commanders, the number of men in their units, and their assigned locations along the shore. The kingdom was mobilizing its defenses against a seaborne invasion. Another set of tablets records a desperate, last-ditch effort to gather resources. It's an emergency levy of bronze from the temples and from individuals across the kingdom. The palace was requisitioning temple bronze, to be taken to the smiths to be reforged, presumably into weapons. The tablets list bronze points for spears and javelins. They were arming for a final stand. It was all for naught. The palace of Nestor was destroyed in a massive conflagration. The attack was so sudden that hundreds of unused clay wine jars were found smashed in the palace storerooms. The kingdom of Pylos vanished. And with the destruction of these palace centers across Greece, the entire edifice of Mycenaean civilization crumbled. The complex bureaucracy, the command economy, the trade networks all disappeared. And most significantly, the knowledge of writing the linear B script was completely lost. It had been the specialized tool of the palace scribes, and with the palaces gone, it had no purpose. Greece plunged into a dark age that would last for 4 centuries. Finally, the great wave of destruction, having shattered the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and scoured the Levant, arrived at the borders of the last great power still standing, Egypt. The story of this final epic confrontation is preserved in stunning detail, on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu in Thebes. Ramesses III was a pharaoh obsessed with his great predecessor, Ramesses II, and he saw this war as his opportunity to achieve eternal glory as the savior of Egypt. He turned his temple into a stone monument to his victory, a vast propagandistic graphic novel of the war against the Sea Peoples. The inscriptions are dramatic and unequivocal. Ramesses frames the conflict in apocalyptic terms. He writes, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms from Hutti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa and Elishia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amur. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them." This is a crucial passage. Ramesses is providing a checklist of the fallen Hutti, the Hittite Empire, Kode, Cilicia, Carchemish, a city on the Euphrates, Arzawa, a kingdom in western Anatolia, and Elishia, Cyprus. He is telling us that this enemy had already destroyed the entire international system before they even reached him. He then lists the members of this new, larger confederation. Their confederation was the Peleset, Sheker, Shikalesh, Denyen and Weshish lands united. Some of these names are familiar from Merneptah's earlier inscription, but new ones have appeared, most notably the Peleset and the Sheker. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict two great climactic battles, one on land and one at sea. The land battle is a maelstrom of organized chaos. The disciplined ranks of Egyptian chariots and infantry crash into the invading host. The Sea Peoples are shown fighting with desperate courage. We can clearly see the different groups. The Shurden are there, with their distinctive horned helmets and round shields. And there are the Peleset and Sheker, distinguished by their tall, feathered or fluted headdresses, which look something like a warrior's crown or a stylized mohawk. Critically, the reliefs confirm what Merneptah's stele hinted at. Behind the battle lines we see the families of the Sea Peoples. They are in heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts, their women and children looking on with expressions of terror as the battle turns against them. This is the ultimate proof that this was not a mere raiding party or a pirate fleet. This was a folk migration, an entire population on the move, burning the world behind them as they searched for a new place to live. The centerpiece of the Medinet Habu reliefs, however, is the naval battle. It is the first large-scale depiction of a naval battle in world history, a masterpiece of narrative art. The scene is set in the mouths of the Nile Delta. Ramesses III, a brilliant tactician, had apparently allowed the enemy fleet to enter the narrow, constricted channels of the river. The Egyptian ships are long and low-slung, propelled by both oars and a single sail. Their prows are carved into the shape of a lion's head, and they are packed with ranks of archers. The ships of the Sea Peoples are different. They are high-prowed, round-hulled vessels, often with a bird's head ornament on the prow and stern. They appear to be primarily sailing ships, built for the open waters of the Mediterranean. In the windless, narrow channels of the Delta, they were at a severe disadvantage. Their sails were useless, and they lacked the maneuverability of the oared Egyptian galleys. The relief captures the brutal, close-quarters combat. Egyptian archers perched in the rigging rained down a deadly hail of arrows onto the packed decks of the enemy ships. Egyptian soldiers used long grappling hooks to snag the enemy vessels, pulling them close for boarding. The water is a nightmarish tangle of overturned ships, shattered oars, and drowning men. The artists show the Sea People's warriors being slaughtered in the water, trapped like birds in a net, as the inscription proudly proclaims. According to his own account, Ramesses III won a total and resounding victory. He had saved Egypt. He had held back the tide of chaos that had engulfed everyone else. He had upheld Maat. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one. The war had exhausted the Egyptian treasury and military. The world that Egypt had once dominated was gone, replaced by a chaotic and impoverished landscape. Egypt survived, but it was diminished, and it soon retreated into a long period of isolation and decline. It had won the battle, but it had lost the world. The Bronze Age collapse was complete. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a world of ash and silence. Part 4. The investigation in search of the culprits. The crime has been committed. The world of the late Bronze Age lies in ruins. We have eyewitness testimony from the victims at Ugarit and a detailed, if propagandistic, police report from the victors in Egypt. The crime scenes from Greece to Anatolia are littered with forensic evidence in the form of destruction layers. Now the most difficult part of our investigation begins. Identifying the culprits. Who exactly were the Sea Peoples? Where did this confederation of destroyers come from? For more than a century, this question has been the holy grail for archaeologists and historians of the period. It's a grand-scale game of historical detective work, matching the enigmatic names from the Egyptian lists Beliset, Sheker, Shurden, Shikalesh, Dinyen, Lutkato known peoples and places from the ancient world. The evidence is fragmentary, the theories are contentious, and absolute certainty remains elusive. But by carefully combining the textual, archaeological, and linguistic clues, a plausible if complex picture begins to emerge. Let us begin with the dominant, overarching theory that now commands the most scholarly consensus. This theory posits that the Sea Peoples were not a single ethnic group, nor a unified nation, nor even a professional pirate navy. Rather, they were a vast, multi-ethnic, and ever-shifting confederation of displaced peoples, a perfect storm of refugees, migrants, opportunistic raiders, and demobilized soldiers, all set in motion by the systemic collapse we have already described. Think of it not as an organized invasion, but as a human wildfire. The initial spark was the climate-induced famine in Greece and Anatolia. This forced the first groups of people off their land. As they moved, they disrupted local communities, creating more instability and displacing more people. This created a domino effect, a rolling snowball of migration and violence. The weakening of the great empires, particularly the Hittites, created a power vacuum on the seas. Piracy, which had always been a low-level problem, became rampant. These pirate bands could have merged with the migrant groups, providing the military muscle and naval know-how. Demobilized or mutinous soldiers from the collapsing Mycenaean and Hittite armies, men with no king to serve and no pay to receive, would have been natural recruits for such a movement. This migrant crisis model is powerful because it explains the key features we see in the evidence. It explains why they traveled with their families in ox carts. They were looking for a new home, not just plunder. It explains the diverse confederation of names. It was a coalition of the desperate, drawing from many different cultures and regions. And it explains their seemingly unstoppable momentum. They were not an army that could be defeated in a single battle and sent home. They had no home to return to. Their only option was to move forward. They were both a cause and a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse, a product of the initial chaos who then became the primary accelerator of that chaos. But this broad model doesn't satisfy our need for specifics. Who were these groups? Let's put on our detective hats and examine the case file for each of the main suspects on Ramesses III's list. Suspect 1: the Peleset. The Peleset are perhaps the most famous and the most securely identified of all the Sea Peoples. The Egyptian reliefs show them as tall, clean-shaven warriors, wearing distinctive headdresses made of feathers or perhaps vertically arranged reeds or leather strips, held in place by a headband. They fight with spears and long, straight swords and carry round shields. The crucial clue to their identity comes from what happened after their defeat by Ramesses III. The pharaoh, in a common ancient practice, settled his captured enemies as garrison troops in a strategic location to act as a buffer for Egypt. He settled the Peleset and their close allies, the Sheker, on the southern coastal plain of Canaan. This region, from that point forward in history, came to be known by a name derived from them, Philistia. The Peleset are, with near unanimous scholarly agreement, the people who became the biblical Philistines. This is one of those rare and satisfying moments where archaeology, textual evidence, and later historical tradition all converge. The Hebrew Bible portrays the Philistines as a powerful, technologically advanced people organized in a league of 5 cities, the Philistine Pentapolis: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Gath, and Ekron, who were the primary antagonists of the early Israelites. Samson fought them, Saul died fighting them, and the young David famously defeated their champion, Goliath of Gath. The archaeology of these Philistine cities is revelatory. Right around 1175 BCE, immediately after the time of Ramesses III's battles, a completely new and foreign material culture appears in these sites. Archaeologists have unearthed a unique style of pottery, known as Philistine bichrome ware. While it was locally made, its shapes and decorative motifs, especially spirals and stylized birds, are not Canaanite at all. They are direct descendants of late Mycenaean Greek and Cypriot pottery styles. The newcomers also brought with them new architectural traditions, such as the Aegean-style hearth sanctuary, a type of building completely unknown in the Levant but common in the Greek world. Their diet changed too. Excavations in Philistine layers reveal a dramatically higher percentage of pig bones compared to their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors, for whom pigs were taboo. Even their technology was different. The Bible speaks of the Philistines having a monopoly on ironworking, a technology that was just beginning to spread during this period of chaos. Everything points to an origin in the Aegean world. The Peleset were almost certainly a group of Mycenaean Greeks, or a closely related people from Crete or the Aegean Islands, who were uprooted during the collapse of their own civilization. They joined the migratory wave, crashed against the shield of Egypt, and were then resettled, where they forged a new and powerful identity for themselves on the coast of the Levant. Suspect 2. The Checker. The Checker are almost always mentioned in conjunction with the Peleset, and appear to have been their closest allies. They are depicted with similar feathered headdresses and seem to have shared a similar fate. A remarkable Egyptian text from a century later, the Report of Weneman, tells the story of an Egyptian official sent to the Phoenician city of Byblos to buy lumber. On his journey, he stops at the port city of Dor, south of modern-day Haifa. He finds Dor ruled by a prince of the Checker. This confirms that the Checker, like the Peleset, established their own city-state in the Levant after the Great Invasion. Archaeological work at Tel Dor has indeed uncovered evidence of a major Sea Peoples settlement there, with cultural links to the Aegean. Their origin, like that of the Peleset, is almost certainly the Mycenaean world. Suspect 3. The Shurden. The Shurden are one of the most intriguing and visually distinct groups. They are instantly recognizable in Egyptian art by their striking horned helmets, round shields, and long slashing swords. They actually have a longer history with Egypt than the other groups. They appear as enemies fighting alongside the Libyans against Ramesses II before the Battle of Kadesh, and later, paradoxically, as elite mercenaries serving in Ramesses II's personal bodyguard during the Battle of Kadesh. This suggests they were a people of skilled mariners and warriors, sometimes raiding, sometimes serving as soldiers for hire. Their name has long been connected with a specific place, the island of Sardinia. The linguistic link Shurden/Sardinia is tantalizing. But is there more? For a long time the evidence was thin. But more recent archaeology on Sardinia has uncovered remarkable finds. The native Nuragic civilization of Sardinia produced a series of stunning bronze figurines, or bronzetti, dating to the period after the Bronze Age collapse. Many of these figurines depict warriors wearing helmets with prominent horns, carrying round shields, and sometimes wearing protective kilts or greaves, uncannily similar to the depictions of the Shurden on the walls of Medinet Habu. Furthermore, recent discoveries have unearthed fragments of Mycenaean-style pottery on Sardinia that date to the exact period of the Sea Peoples movements, suggesting direct contact. The debate now is about the direction of travel. Did the Sherdin originate in Sardinia and travel east to become pirates and mercenaries? Or were they, like the Peleset, an Aegean people who, after their defeat and adventures, eventually migrated west and settled on Sardinia, giving the island their name and influencing its local warrior culture? Most scholars now lean towards the latter interpretation. The Sherdin were likely another component of the Aegean exodus who, after a long and violent journey, found their final home in the western Mediterranean. Suspect 4. The Shikalesh and the Aquesh. These two groups are often linked with the western Mediterranean as well. The Shikalesh, mentioned by both Merneptah and Ramesses III, are frequently connected by name to the island of Sicily. The ancient Greeks knew the native inhabitants of eastern Sicily as the Sicels. Again, the name is a tempting match, but direct archaeological evidence of their activity in the east or a clear trail leading back to Sicily is currently lacking. They remain a plausible but unproven part of the puzzle. The Aquesh, mentioned only in Merneptah's inscription, are more controversial. As noted, the text says they were circumcised, which strongly points to an Aegean origin. An early and very popular theory identified the Aquesh with the Achaeans, Achaioi, one of the primary names used by Homer to describe the Greeks who fought at Troy. If this is true, it means a contingent of Mycenaean Greeks were part of the first wave of attackers who assaulted Egypt alongside the Libyans. This theory has lost some favor, as the linguistic connection is not as straightforward as it first appears, but the possibility remains tantalizing. Suspect 5. The Dinyan. The Dinyan are listed as a major part of the confederation that attacked Ramesses III. Their identification is also hotly debated. The most popular theory links them to the Danaoi or Danuna, another name Homer used for the Greeks. A statue base from the temple of Amenhotep III, long before the collapse, mentions a kingdom of the Danuna, in or near southern Anatolia, which seems to have had strong connections to the Aegean. A later text from the Assyrians mentions them in the same region. It is plausible that the Denyen were a powerful Aegean or Anatolian coastal people who were displaced and joined the migration. Some scholars have even tried to connect them to the Israelite tribe of Dan, which the Bible describes as a seafaring people who initially settled on the coast before migrating north, but this theory is considered highly speculative by most. Suspect 6. The Lucca. The Lucca are mentioned in texts from across the Bronze Age, long before the final collapse. They appear in Hittite archives as a rebellious, semi-independent people living on the southwestern coast of Anatolia, in a region that would later be known as Lycia. The linguistic link Lucca/Lycia is very strong. The Hittite texts consistently portray them as troublesome, unreliable vassals, frequently engaging in piracy. They were likely a collection of coastal communities who had always lived on the fringes of empire, making a living from the sea through trade, fishing, and raiding. When the central authority of the Hittite Empire collapsed, it's logical that they would have seized the opportunity, joining the larger migratory wave as experienced pirates and sea raiders, acting as the naval specialists for the Confederation. So, our investigation yields a complex group portrait. The Sea Peoples were not one people but many. The core of the Confederation that brought about the final collapse seems to have been composed of peoples from the collapsing Mycenaean/Aegean cultural sphere, the Peleset, Sheker, and possibly the Denyen and Aquesh. They were the desperate migrants, fleeing the famine and chaos in their homelands. They were joined by opportunistic and established freebooters like the Anatolian Lucca, and perhaps other wandering warrior bands from the western Mediterranean like the Sherdin and Shikalesh. It was a coalition born of desperation and opportunity, a rolling tide of humanity that gathered mass and momentum as it swept eastwards along the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant. They dismantled the Hittite Empire, sacked Cyprus and Ugarit, and threw themselves at Egypt. They were not a coordinated army with a single general, but a phenomenon, the human face of a systemic collapse. This is the closest we can come to unmasking them. They remain a shadowy coalition, their individual identities still debated, their ultimate origins lost in the fog of a world that they themselves helped to destroy. And perhaps that is their most enduring legacy. They are the great unidentified enemy of antiquity, a perpetual reminder of how much of our past is, and will forever remain, a profound historical mystery. Part 5. The Legacy: A New World from the Ashes. The storm had passed. The fires had gone out. The invading tide had receded. But the world it left behind was unrecognizable. The aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse and the rampage of the Sea Peoples was a long, dark twilight. The centuries that followed, from roughly 1150 BCE down to about 800 BCE, are known to historians as the Greek Dark Ages, but the darkness was not confined to Greece. A profound cultural and economic regression settled over the entire eastern Mediterranean. The great imperial structures were gone. The glittering palaces of Mycenae, Hattusa, and Pylos were empty, windswept ruins, their secrets buried under layers of earth. The intricate web of international trade and diplomacy was shattered. The flow of copper, tin, gold, and luxury goods ceased. The world became a poorer, more fragmented, and more isolated place. The demographic collapse was stunning. Archaeological surveys show that the population of Greece may have plummeted by as much as 75%. In Anatolia, vast regions were depopulated. Villages were abandoned, and people reverted to a simpler, more pastoral way of life. The grand architectural and engineering skills of the Bronze Age were lost. No one was building cyclopean walls or vast temple complexes anymore. And as we have seen, the most devastating loss was the loss of memory itself. The art of writing, in the form of linear B in Greece and cuneiform in Anatolia, vanished completely. These complex scripts, which required years of training by a specialized class of scribes, were tools of the palace bureaucracy. With the palaces destroyed, the scribal class disappeared, and the skill died with them. For centuries, the people of these lands were illiterate. Their own magnificent history, the names of their great kings, the records of their administration, were now unintelligible marks on broken bits of clay. It was a societal amnesia. But this darkness was not an ending. It was a crucible. It was a long, fallow winter that allowed the seeds of a new and different world to germinate in the ashes of the old. The Bronze Age collapse, for all its brutality, was a great reset. It was a violent, chaotic, but ultimately transformative event that cleared the way for the emergence of the societies that would form the foundation of the classical world and, by extension, our own. The collapse shattered the rigid, top-down, authoritarian structures of the Bronze Age palace kingdoms. These highly centralized command economies had been powerful but, as we saw, incredibly brittle. Their destruction created a power vacuum, an open space for new, more decentralized, and ultimately more resilient forms of social and political organization to emerge. Let us look at the new players who rose from the rubble. In the Levant, the destruction of the Egyptian and Hittite empires, the two great hegemonic powers that had dominated the region for centuries, opened the field for local peoples to assert their independence. Our old friends, the Peleset, now settled as the Philistines, created a powerful and independent confederation of 5 city-states. They became a major political and military force, bringing with them their Aegean traditions and their new ironworking technology. Their neighbors in the hill country to the east, a collection of pastoralist tribes known as the Israelites, also seized the opportunity. Freed from the oversight of the Egyptian Empire, they began to coalesce, first as a tribal league led by charismatic judges, and then, partly in response to the threat posed by the powerful Philistines, into a unified monarchy under kings like Saul, David, and Solomon. The entire narrative of the early Hebrew Bible is set against the backdrop of this post-collapse world. On the coast, the surviving Canaanite cities, such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, were also freed from imperial domination. They reinvented themselves. They turned to the one resource they had left: the sea. They became the Phoenicians, the greatest maritime traders the world had yet seen. Their ships, more advanced than those of the Bronze Age, ventured further than ever before, establishing colonies and trading posts across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to North Africa, where they founded the great city of Carthage, and perhaps even out into the Atlantic. And the Phoenicians carried with them not just goods, but an idea, a revolutionary piece of technology: the alphabet. The old writing systems, cuneiform and hieroglyphics, were incredibly complex, with hundreds of signs requiring a lifetime of study. The Phoenician alphabet was a radical simplification, a system of just 22 simple signs, each representing a consonant sound. It was easy to learn, easy to use, and could be written on any surface. It democratized literacy, taking it out of the exclusive hands of palace scribes and making it available to merchants, artisans, and ordinary people. This alphabet would be the single most important cultural export of the post-collapse world. In Greece, after 4 centuries of silence and poverty, a renaissance began around the 8th century BCE. The old, centralized Mycenaean kingdoms were gone forever. In their place, a new and radical political idea emerged: the polis or city-state. These were small, independent communities like Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, where citizens began to participate in their own governance. This decentralized, competitive world of the polis would prove to be an incredibly dynamic engine of innovation in politics, philosophy, art, and science. When writing returned to Greece, it was not the old, forgotten linear B. The Greeks adopted the revolutionary Phoenician alphabet, adding signs for vowels to better suit their own language. And one of the first things they used this new tool for was to write down the stories that had been passed down orally through the long Dark Age, the dim, half-remembered folk memories of the lost Bronze Age world. They told stories of great fortress palaces, of a mighty king named Agamemnon, of a decade-long war against a city in Anatolia, and of the long and difficult homecomings of heroes. These stories were woven together into the epic poems we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey. The traumatic memory of the Bronze Age collapse had been transformed into the heroic mythology that would become the bedrock of Western literature. The world also changed technologically. The collapse of the tin trade made bronze, the metal of the old elites, scarce and prohibitively expensive. This forced people to turn to a more common, but initially more difficult to work, metal: iron. The Iron Age was born from the ashes of the Bronze Age. Iron was more plentiful and accessible, and the knowledge of how to smelt and forge it spread widely during the Dark Ages. This too had a democratizing effect. An iron-tipped plow was more efficient, and iron weapons were available to a much broader class of citizen soldiers, undermining the old model of the elite, bronze-clad chariot warrior. So, the legacy of the Sea Peoples is profoundly dualistic. They were the agents of a terrifying apocalypse. They brought an end to a brilliant and sophisticated world, plunging it into centuries of poverty and darkness. Their story is a chilling cautionary tale about the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations, a reminder that the complex systems that sustain us can unravel with shocking speed. But they were also, unintentionally, the harbingers of a new dawn. By shattering the old rigid empires, they cleared the ground for a new world to grow. The Bronze Age of monolithic, palace-controlled empires gave way to the Iron Age of dynamic city-states, alphabetic literacy, and citizen-led societies. The mysterious raiders who ended an age, the great unidentified enemy from the sea, closed the book on one long chapter of human history. But in doing so, they inadvertently set the stage for the next, allowing for the rise of the Phoenicians, the Israelites, the Philistines, and ultimately the Greeks and the Romans. Their profound and violent impact is a testament to the fact that sometimes, in the grand sweeping narrative of human history, the most devastating endings are also the most creative beginnings. The mystery of their identity may never be fully resolved, but their work, for better and for worse, shaped the world we inhabit today. Thank you for joining me on this deep and extensive investigation into the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse. We have journeyed through a lost world of wonders, stood witness to its fiery demise, and sifted through the cold ashes in search of answers. This is one of those profound historical mysteries where the lines between cause and effect, victim and perpetrator, become blurred. The story of a world brought to its knees by a shadowy coalition from the sea is a powerful epic of ancient warfare, societal fragility, and the enduring power of human desperation. It reminds us that the past is not a static collection of facts, but a vast, ongoing investigation, a cold case just waiting for new evidence and new eyes. If you have found this immersive journey into the past to be a worthy use of your time, and if you appreciate this deep dive approach to storytelling, please consider showing your support for Bedtime History. A simple like, a subscription to the channel, and activating the notification bell are the best ways to ensure you do not miss our next exploration into the great mysteries of our shared past. Look at who rose from the rubble. In the Levant, the destruction of the Egyptian and Hittite empires created a power vacuum. Into this space stepped a collection of new peoples and city-states. The Philistines are old friends. The Pelasgites established a powerful league of 5 cities and became a major force in the region. Their neighbors, a group of semi-nomadic tribes in the highlands, coalesced into the Kingdom of Israel. And along the coast, the surviving Canaanite cities, no longer under Egyptian or Hittite dominion, reinvented themselves as the Phoenicians, the greatest sea traders the world had ever known. It was the Phoenicians who would develop a revolutionary new technology, a simple 22-character alphabet that was easy to learn and use. It was this alphabet that would eventually be adopted by the Greeks and Romans and become the ancestor of the alphabet you are reading right now. And what of Greece? After centuries of silence, it too re-emerged. The old Mycenaean palaces were gone, but in their place arose a new political unit, the polis or city-state. Athens, Sparta, Corinth. This new world was decentralized, competitive, and innovative. When writing returned to Greece around the 8th century BCE, it was not the old, cumbersome linear B, but the new, flexible Phoenician alphabet, adapted to their own language. And with the return of writing came the return of stories. The dim folk memories of the lost Bronze Age, of the great kings and mighty fortresses and a catastrophic war, were woven together into the epic poems we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Bronze Age collapse had become the stuff of legend, the heroic age of myth. So, the legacy of the Sea Peoples and the collapse they brought about is a dual one. It was an age of terror and destruction, a true apocalypse that ended one of the most brilliant chapters in human history. It represents a chilling reminder of the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. But it was also a catalyst for transformation. The shattering of the old world cleared the ground for a new one to be built. The rigid, bronze-clad empires of kings and scribes gave way to the more flexible, iron-wielding world of city-states, alphabetic literacy, and citizen soldiers. The mysterious raiders who ended an age, a coalition of ghosts from the sea, inadvertently cleared the stage for the rise of the Philistines, the Israelites, the Phoenicians, and ultimately the Greeks and Romans. They closed one book of history, but in doing so they allowed a new one to be opened. The mystery of who they were may never be fully solved, but their impact is written all across the world that followed. They remain a testament to the fact that sometimes, history's greatest endings are also its most profound beginnings.